Welcome. I'm Sherry Goodman, Director of Education here at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our program today, which is occasioned by our new exhibition, Gordon Parks, The Making of an Argument. The exhibition, which originated at the New Orleans Museum of Art, curated there by Russell Lord, is on view until December 17th. And it's an exhibition that focuses on Gordon Parks' first photo essay for Life magazine and on the ways that the photo essay ended up shaping or reshaping the story. Okay? So our sincere thanks to Assistant Curator Stephanie Canizzo, along with curatorial intern Leigh Raiford Cohen, for their thoughtful installation here at Berkeley, their thoughtful organization of the Berkeley iteration of the exhibition. And I would also like to express gratitude to the funders of the exhibition, an anonymous donor, and Jenkins Johnson Gallery in San Francisco, which will be having a concurrent exhibition of Gordon Parks' work starting later in October. So today's discussion features Makeda Best, Tina Sachs, and Ken Light. Our moderator, who will introduce the presenters, is Leigh Raiford, Associate Professor of African American Studies here at UC Berkeley, where she also serves as affiliate faculty in the program in American Studies and in the Department of Gender and Women's Studies. We're delighted that Professor Raiford is here to frame and help shape the discussion. Professor Raiford is the author of Imprisoned in a Luminous Glare, Photography and the African American Freedom Struggle, and co-editor with Heike Rafael Hernandez of the recently published Migrating the Black Body, Visual Culture and the African Diaspora. Her work has appeared in popular publications such as Aperture and Ms. Magazine, as well as in numerous academic journals. Her essays have also been featured in the collections Only Skin Deep, Changing Visions of the American Self, which is a history of race and photography in the United States, and in Pictures and Progress, Early Photography and the Making of African American Identity. So before turning this over to Professor Raiford, I want to mention two things. First, that there will be an extensive film series throughout the month of November, which will be featuring the films of Gordon Parks, who was a very, very important filmmaker. And it will range from his short documentaries to his feature films like Shaft and others. Details about that film series are on the museum's website. And also to invite you to a reception right out in the atrium space adjacent, immediately following the program. So now, Professor Raiford.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today, and welcome again to the opening panel for the new show, Gordon Parks, The Making of an Argument. And again, just to reiterate Sherry's comments, this show comes to us from the New Orleans Museum of Art, and I want to thank Stephanie Canizzo for her really excellent work in putting this together for Berkeley Art Museum, along with her curatorial intern, Leigh Raiford Cohen, who has a special space in my heart as my oldest child. And also this is really exciting because Stephanie just informed me as well that this is the first time that there's been a show of Gordon Parks' work here at the Berkeley Art Museum. So this is really exciting for us. Gordon Parks famously wrote that the camera was his weapon of choice. However, it was never a blunt instrument in his hands. Rather, Parks, across the span of a career of more than 6 decades, made images that attempted to show the full spectrum of Black life. The quotidian and the spectacular, the noisy and the quiet, Black life in its moments of boredom and frustration, in its sadness and joy, the shameful, the glorious, the beautiful, and the terrible. But the story of Parks's first photo essay for Life magazine, featuring Harlem Gang leader Leonard Red Jackson, as told through the Making of an Argument show, demonstrates how quickly complexity can be flattened or clarity obfuscated, how a frame can be tightened and a broad perspective foreshortened. And in the process, how easily meaning can be manipulated. And even by those liberal forces like Life magazine, who consider themselves allies in the fight for social justice. And Parks struggled for the integrity of his project, his integrity as an artist, Red's integrity as a young black man, Harlem's integrity as a community. And it was a fight that included Parks destroying some of his own negatives so they would not be used out of context. Gordon Parks, The Making of an Argument, then, is an exhibit that offers a timely and important set of lessons for us as we fight for justice and equity in this, our own moment. And I think for those of us who have learned so acutely these past few weeks about free speech, that free speech is not so evenly applied to or accessed by all groups. It is not unmediated, and it carries real material consequences, especially for the subjugated. And these are really acutely, keenly brought to us in The Making of an Argument. We are fortunate today to have three incredible and incredibly knowledgeable panelists to help us parse out some of these lessons. And I will introduce each of them in the order that they will speak. After each of their comments, we will move up here onto the podium together. I will ask a few questions and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. But our first speaker today, we welcome home to the Bay Area, Dr. Makeda Best. Dr. Best is the Richard L. Menschel Curator of Photography at the Harvard Art Museum. She's particularly interested in text and image and documentary. Dr. Best has previously published on topics including soldier photography and memory and Hiroshima. She is co-editor of Conflict, Identity, and Protest in American Art, which was published in 2016, and has forthcoming publications on the Civil War era photographer Alexander Gardner, and an essay on photography and incarceration. Our second presenter will be Ken Light. Ken Light has worked as a freelance documentary photographer focusing on social issues facing America for over 45 years. His work has been published in 9 books, including With These Hands, Texas Death Row, and Valley of Shadows and Dreams. He's also the author of the text Witness in Our Time, Lives of Working Documentary Photographers, now in its 2nd edition. He was the recipient of 2 National Endowment for the Arts Photographers Fellowships and the Dorothea Lange Fellowship. His work has been in numerous magazines, newspapers, and a variety of media, and presented in over 190 exhibitions worldwide. And he is also the Reva and David Logan Professor of Photojournalism at the Graduate School of Journalism here at UC Berkeley. Our final presenter is Tina Sachs. Tina Sachs is an assistant professor here at UC Berkeley School of Social Welfare. Her forthcoming book, Invisible Visits, Black Middle-Class Women in the American Healthcare System, investigates the persistence of racial and gender discrimination in healthcare settings among racial minorities who are not poor. Professor Sachs also uses the arts, including films and other media, to help students and the public relate to social problems. She frequently collaborates with her husband, Carlos Javier Ortiz, a 2016 Guggenheim Fellow, photographer and documentary filmmaker, on issues affecting Black and Latino communities. Professor Sachs serves as the executive producer for their documentary film projects, including 1,000 Midnights, their 2016 short documentary about the Great Migration, which was published in the New Yorker magazine. Please join me in welcoming all of our panelists, and particularly Dr. Makeda Best, who will start us off.
Thank you, Leigh, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. Opening the pages of Life magazine, by then the most innovative and popular magazine in America, readers would have found in Gordon Parks' essay, Harlem Gang Leader, the kind of picture-based text they had come accustomed to. Nestled among a magazine heavy on photographic content and graphic advertisements, Parks' story would have provided a visual reference for a common topic in contemporary journalism, which highlighted the rise of the urban street gang in Harlem in particular. In Parks' photo essay, readers encountered a typical autobiographical approach that was used in life advertising as well as content. 17-year-old Leonard "Red" Jackson is graphically and textually cast as the typical Harlem child. An inset photograph depicts Red with a text that contextualizes him as one of Harlem's many children, quote, with nothing to do but roam, and, quote, band together in street gangs. Red, we are told, entered a gang around age 12. Everyone has given up on kids like Red. Quote, at the close of each day, overworked teachers are glad to turn their restless pupils back into the streets. Moving between text and image, the reader imagines the streets teeming with would-be gang members, and we imagine Red staring out at his domain, threateningly pondering his next, no doubt dangerous move. Although scholars have pointed out that much of what Parks intended to show about Red was left out by editors, I would like to suggest other contexts for understanding this body of work. By the time he became the first African-American photographer at life, he'd already published his first two books, including Camera Portraits, Techniques and Principles of Documentary Portraiture from 1948, and worked for the Depression-era photographic project, the Farm Security Administration, and as a correspondent for the Office of War Information. Born in Fort Scott, Kansas in 1912, he started photographing at age 25 when he found a camera in a pawn shop and was first noticed for his documentary images of Chicago, where he spent time as a young adult. In his 1966 autobiography, A Choice of Weapons, Parks explained, quote, I choose my camera as a weapon against all the things I dislike about America, poverty, racism, discrimination. Arguably from his time working for the Farm Security Administration, a government-funded image campaign headed by Roy Stryker, known for his rigorous editing and efforts to shape content produced by the Bureau, Parks was familiar with the fact that his images would be used and framed in ways that he may have not intended. And in particular, this is one of the images that you'll see in the exhibition that is changed. I'll come back to that. And here are some images from the Farm Security Administration, which was also known for changing images such as this one, where, for example, family members are cropped out in order to focus our attention on the children and in their plight. So he had worked for this bureau before he became to life. I am interested in three contexts for Harlem Gang Leader: how African Americans appeared in Life magazine in this era, the Double V campaign of the World War II era, and how African Americans attempted to use the war effort as a mechanism to push for greater equality, and Parks's broader efforts to present to a wider audience a humanistic portrait of African American life in the post-war era. And we can look through the essay now in case you're not familiar with it, in case you haven't seen it. So this is the cover of the magazine. We have the inset image that I already mentioned. We enter here and we're already thrust into the gang world, and Red kind of fighting over territory. And there's the photograph of Red and his family. Here are Red and his comrades attending a funeral for one of their other comrades, and there they are, kind of defending their territory. And then Red is kind of picked to be part of or he gets involved in a kind of anti-violence campaign kind of effort, and here he is with some of those leaders here. The ending in which the efforts are kind of exposed as not quite being what they were proposed to be, and Red kind of leaves on his own at the end. Now, Life was no ordinary publication in which to publish a story about African American life. Since its debut in 1836, the publishers and editors had engaged in a cultural project linked to ideals about American democracy and visual literacy as a social tool. Within 4 weeks of its publication, circulation reached 1 million. Within 4 years, it gained a pass-along factor of 14, meaning that the average of 14 people read each issue of Life magazine. Purchasing, reading, and sharing Life magazine was in effect a civilizing ritual. Advertisements sought to shape consumers through a pedagogy of consumption in which proper purchasing was linked to good citizenship. More importantly, and what would have been attractive to Parks, who was seeking a new era of race relations, the magazine distinctly linked itself to a modern America. New media forms like Life mediated between the old and the new, explaining and teaching who the modern citizen was. As publisher Henry Luce wrote, "The hope of American democracy is intelligence, and the food of intelligence is information." Yet Parks's essay was published during a publishing moment in Life's history in which it promoted what media historians describe as an iconography of segregation, in images that evoke values of physical comfort, relaxation, and security, and social support. African Americans are servants who anticipate and fulfill the needs of whites. In these ads, African Americans are predominantly dark-skinned males and are depicted as porters, waiters, or personal servants. They speak in implausible dialect. Few advertisements featured only African Americans, and they are never shown with family, friends, or partners. Parks, who photographed Dr. Kenneth Clark conducting one of his infamous studies of the psychological effects of segregation, had already worked to produce pictorial documents that demonstrated the impact of such pervasive images. Harlem Gang Leader, we can think of, follows a distinct narrative arc that is familiar throughout Parks's works, and is these themes that through which he often communicated the complexity of his subjects. Coincidentally, as scholars have noted, Parks's subjects were often male. Parks's schema follows the arc of the subject's invisibility, the subject's emergence, and ultimately his ascendance. In this schema, invisibility is a lack of direction, constricted opportunity to fully express their humanity, dormant sense of self-awareness. Emergence is characterized by the kind of readiness to confront violence, assertive acts of manhood, and awakened self-awareness. Ascendance can be interpreted as the power to effectively direct or deflect violence, the recognition of violence as a weapon of last resort, and agency over the definition and representation of their masculinity. In many ways, of course, it seems these narrative themes recall Parks's own experience in coming of age as an African American man. Parks wrote 5 autobiographical works and granted numerous interviews to talk about his life experiences. It is insightful to think about few of these anecdotes in particular as we interpret the story of Red Jackson. For example, Parks recalled going to films as a youth and responding to the dominant representation of blacks as menial. Quote, "I was demeaned by this theory, and that's the way blacks should be shown. I came out of there with my head tucked between my legs, ashamed of being black. That's the thing that did it, that ruined a lot of black people." In another statement, he demonstrates he was consciously aware of the choice he made not to be ruined. He said, quote, "I did suppress layer upon layer of rage during my childhood and youth, much of which was provoked by whites who held me inferior because I was black. But the energy I might have burned to sustain such animosity toward my tormentors was instead used to prove them wrong." He described my young life. Quote, "I always had to sit in the peanut gallery, or the Negro section of the theaters. We weren't allowed to drink soda in the drugstore or in town. I was stoned and beaten and called nigger, black boy, darky, and shine. These indignities came so often that I began to expect them as normal." There was also physical violence. Childhood friends were victims of various assaults. There was a white police officer in his native Fort Scott named Kirby, known for his carrying 2 big guns on his hips and nicknamed Murderer because of the number of African Americans he had sent to their graves. Similarly to his photographs, violence and anger give way to rebirth and regeneration. He reflected on his state of mind during his young adulthood. I did a lot of thinking about the white man and his brutality, realizing that it was nudging me toward a hatred of him. I was overwhelmed by the many injustices already fastened in my memory. I had sort of limped through the early years, accepting as a normal scar a scar for a scar. Now I felt a permanent anger after each clash. He recounted a night in jail. I made up my mind there in the cab of that truck that I wouldn't allow my life to be conditioned by what others thought or did, or give in to anyone who made me be subservient. I could no longer call myself a boy. I knew then that youth, as it should be at 17, was not for me, and that full manhood must come quickly. A similar sentiment is pictorially presented at the end of Harlem Gang Leader. The caption reads, "When all was said and done, Red could count the people, white or colored, who were seriously or practically interested in his troubles on the fingers of one hand." Yet Parks's last photograph, shot from a low vantage point with Red looming above, walking away in his suit, projects someone who counts chiefly on himself. He walks into a blurry background, caught mid-stride by Parks. There is this image of Parks. Now, the idea of spiritual and literal ascendance is a pictorial motif that Parks would return to again and again. And here, most famously, Parks and Red, as I think of them together. Here's a close-up of that image in which Red is walking at the end of Harlem Gang Leader. So he returns to this theme of the sidewalk again and again, and here perhaps most famously in a later picture essay he made in collaboration with his friend, author Ralph Ellison, author of the seminal novel Invisible Man. Parks often takes unusually low vantage points and depicts his subjects' interactions with the ground. Now, Red Jackson was just one of the figures through which Parks tried to recast the perception of African Americans and American life at mid-century. In so doing, he often adopted the familiar iconography of American art and life. He was also adept at applying the visual vocabulary of more commercial pictorial genres, like fashion photography, in which he also excelled. Harlem Gang Leader's presentation does more than refute the kind of racist plastic depictions of African Americans in life's advertisements. It offers a different history lesson and a more pointed historical message. On the cover was General Loris Norstad, decorated veteran and director of the Plans and Operations Division of the War Department, and promoted as the new face of American strategy during World War II, following World War II. During World War II, of course, the African American community had launched the historic Double V campaign. The Double V campaign was a slogan and drive to promote the fight for democracy abroad and within the United States for African Americans during World War II. The double V refers to the victory, V for victory sign, prominently displayed by countries fighting for, quote, for victory over aggression, slavery, and tyranny, but also adopts a second V to represent the double victory for African Americans fighting for freedom and overseas and at home. African Americans enlisted in large numbers to fight in World War II, as they had in previous wars, and yet upon returning home, race relations and economic conditions for African Americans only continued to worsen. The subtext, I would argue, for Harlem Gang Leader is the failure of World War II to attain victory over its domestic problems, which paved the way for the kind of conditions Parks encountered in Harlem in 1948. Sorry, it's my other era I used to work on. Now, to conclude, I think this session is valuable and is necessary and part of an ongoing effort to recognize Parks's contribution. I would argue that like other types of African American photographic practices, such as scrapbooking, the critical dialogue that Parks's projects engage is often overlooked because they speak through untraditional means and means that often have to do with the personal in relationship to the broader society. We can call these works of visual insurgency, part of a lifelong and historic project, going back to arguably Frederick Douglass, of critiquing existing images of African Americans and deploying alternative visualizations to restore agency to them. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Gordon Parks from my perspective as a working photographer. And the way I see it, Gordon Parks is one of the great photographers and Renaissance man of the 20th century. His photography, his film, his poetry, his motion pictures, his activisms, and yes, he had a great mustache. Some of us can appreciate that. Parks was drawn to photography as a young man when he saw images of migrant workers published in a magazine, and after buying a camera at a pawn shop, he taught himself how to use it. I have a small personal connection to Gordon Parks, and I remember seeing him and being amazed by his activist voice. I was a young anti-war organizer, and I'd just begun to identify myself as an activist photographer in 1970. It was May 1970, days after the Kent State killings. Gordon Parks came to Ohio University, where I was a freshman, to talk to the photo department, which I was not part of. And when he heard about a student strike, as I said, this was days after Kent State, he came over to the rally, and he puts on an armband, and he gives a power salute, and he gives an inspiring talk about activism and what was happening in America. And why I say I had a personal connection, that person on the right behind him giving the fist is me. So this was just an amazing experience to see a Life magazine photographer. I mean, you have to really get it, what Life magazine stood for, what they were, Henry Luce, their political direction, their conservative nature of the magazine, their anti-communism, their hatred of people with long hair, and the anti-war movement. And there you see this iconic photographer, Gordon Parks, taking time from this lecture he was invited to talk to at the university to come across campus where a bunch of us young people protesting the killings at Kent State University, and kind of just unmasks himself and becomes this real person, this individual who talks about being an activist and what is happening in the world in his own personal connection. Gordon Parks' work, I think, to photographers is so influential. He had a one-year fellowship with the Farm Security Administration, which was then chronicling the nation's depression and social conditions. And while he was at the FSA, he also was suffering the effects of segregation. He was kicked out of a movie theater, he was told to eat in the back of a restaurant, he was dismissed by a department store clerk, all in one day. He struggled to depict his experiences. The story goes that Roy Stryker, who was the director of the Farm Security Administration, counseled Parks not to betray the bigots, but instead to talk to people who suffered from their actions. The result was one of the most recognizable images, which Makeda discussed, American Gothic, a haunting image of Ella Watson, a black cleaner who stood motionless in front of the US flag in the building that actually housed the FSA. And it was really, again, remarkable that within the space in which he was working as an intern, as a photographer, that he could recognize the conditions that others existed in. And he could go out and he could personally make this photograph, which is really, I think, so connecting, and to this day is just one of the great images in the history of photography. Early in his career, he collaborated twice with Ralph Ellison on projects that were intended to reveal underlying truths about the New York City neighborhood that was sometimes called the capital of Black America, Harlem. Their first effort in 1947 was never published. But throughout his career, and these are some of the photographs that Gordon Parks made, throughout his career, he made incredibly dramatic, shocking, and startling photographs. There's a sensitivity, there's a sense of light and space and composition, all things that photographers are thinking about and looking about. And you only have to imagine him bringing his own experience into these spaces and then trying to convey the intense feeling and the intense moment that he was observing. His pictures really were used as a weapon against the dominant culture and the power structure. Both Parks and Ellison both mourned the psychological damage that racism had inflicted on them. But how do you find this? How do you find a visual moment? It's one thing, I think, to write a story. It's another thing to actually encounter that moment and to watch it and push that shutter button to capture that moment in which you have the sense of loss of dignity, the sense of loss of power, or sometimes the courage that he found in individuals that he photographed. He talked about that there was no room in their Harlem for a Duke Ellington or a Langston Hughes, or even for the ordinary pleasures of love and laughter. Instead, Harlem was, in Ellison's word, the scene and symbol of Negroes' perpetual alienation in the land of his birth. And they also looked, Gordon Parks also looked at the power that was emerging from these communities and how do you portray this power. And there weren't many photographers making these kind of photographs. In 1956, Gordon Parks went to Alabama for Life magazine. And this is one of the cameras he used, a twin lens reflex camera. Shoots a square negative, and it's a camera that, it's called a waist level camera, so you actually look down at your subjects, and it creates a different way of seeing visually than the traditional 35 millimeter camera. I find these pictures remarkable. And I find them remarkable for a number of reasons. One, in 1956, it was the same year that Rosa Parks sat in a bus designated for whites only in Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested for this act of defiance. As we know, the arrest resulted in demonstrations and a boycott of buses by the African American community, which lasted until 1956. I can only wonder what Gordon Parks was thinking. I can only wonder, to be a black man in America in 1956, working for one of the greatest magazines in the history of magazine publications, to come across a sign that says colored entrance in your own country. And the power of how do you make that photograph? And this is just, I find, a remarkable photograph. The mother and child, the dignity in the way they're dressed, and yet there they are under, I mean, it's not just a colored sign, it's a neon. Think about it, it's a neon sign. It's remarkable that someone actually had to go to a shop and have a neon sign made. I mean, and again, to be this photographer in 1956 and encounter this, and then to continue to photograph. And one of the great things about Gordon Parks, he didn't view himself as an activist first, a photographer second, or vice versa, but these two things were intermingled. And I also wonder the battles, and I haven't really, I know his book talks a little bit about this, or his biographies, autobiographies, but you only can imagine the battles within Life magazine. I mean, we've seen some of what happened with the Gang Leader photo essay and the cropping and the way the pictures were positioned. But he really saw his camera as an enabler for social change. And as a young black man in the racially divided America with this amazing publication behind him, and photographers who work with Life magazine will tell you that Life magazine press pass was like a get out of jail free press pass. You could virtually go anywhere. And Life magazine, as Makeda said, it had a huge, huge circulation. And it opened a lot of doors. But again, I really wonder what his experience was like going into these towns and photographing. These were towns controlled by white citizens, committees, very tightly controlled. And I know many photographers, white photographers who went into the South in the 60s to photograph, were run out of town, were beaten. And so we have to not only look at these pictures as wonderful pictures, But we also have to admire the amazing skill that Gordon Parks had to get into these situations and photograph and record. And really they are a witness to this horrible part of American history that we tend to kind of cover up and don't talk about. And I think that's one of the amazing parts of his photography. He was able to enter places his white contemporaries didn't even know to look. And there had to be a kind of connection between himself and the people he was photographing. His lens was really unflinching, his message clear, his compassion for the individuals he photographed. If his camera were to be his chosen weapon, then he would be using it effectively. His pictures were haunting. They told stories that could begin conversations about radical societal change. And there's also a beauty. And also, these pictures are very rare. And they're not only rare because of the nature of the content of them, but they're rare because they're in color. And his mastery of the color, I mean, the color is remarkable. And I hate to, I mean, these are very sad, sad and powerful images about a time in America that should have never been. But there's an artistry and a use of color in these images that is remarkable. And I say this because very few photographers shot color in 1956. It was not an easy task. There were no automatic exposures. You had a handheld light meter. He's using that camera in which you're looking down. You have to focus. But he caught these amazing moments that speak to his incredible photographic talent and his ability to be incredibly observant, and not only be incredibly observant, but to understand what that observance was about, what that story was about, finding that moment in which all the elements come together, and thinking about the way this photograph is composed with the young boy. You only see the boy on the right. You see only the overalls and the cuffs of the pants and the bare feet, and the other boy bent over. And you have to remember, he was present, he was there. These young children knew he was there because he's an outsider with a camera, and a black outsider with a camera, even more rare. And he had to be very patient and think about what he was observing and how to make that photograph. And I wanted to show a group of photographs that I think Parks threw himself into photographing the militant struggle that erupted in America. And of course, this is Malcolm X. He photographed many, many important moments in American history during this time that were largely ignored other than by the working press. And so the working press, photographers working for newspapers would get it sent on an assignment, and they'd go and they'd shoot, and they'd come back with one or two images, and they would be reproduced in the newspaper. But I like to think there is a completely different passion in Gordon Parks. And the passion is that this was his community, these were his people, and he would see this in a very, very different way. There was a spiritual connection between himself and the individuals he was observing. And these moments, again, are very difficult to photograph. And I know there's some photographers in the audience. you know that to get into an event that's a moving, swirling event with people with signs and shouting and police officers and being pushed back, and it's not easy to make a photograph in these kind of moments. But to really make a photograph that has some content and some thought to them. He did a lot of work with the black Muslim community in civil rights demonstrations. And of course, he was one of many photographers that photographed the Great March on Washington, D.C. for human rights and freedom. He photographed the Black Panther Party. This is Eldred Cleaver and Kathleen Cleaver. He was a staunch and outspoken supporter of civil rights. And Malcolm X would later name Parks as a godfather to one of his children. Gordon Parks was a remarkable photographer and a humanist. And I think the best way to end my presentation is with a quote from Gordon Parks that sums up his activism, both photographic and political. He says, "I picked up a camera because it was my choice of weapons against what I hated most about the universe: racism, intolerance, poverty. I could have just as easily picked up a knife or a gun, like many of my childhood friends did, most of whom were murdered or put in prison, but I chose not to go that way. I felt that I could somehow subdue these evils by doing something beautiful that people recognize me by, and thus make a whole different life for myself." A great man, a great activist, a great photographer. We all have a lot to learn from his vision and his thought. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here because I am not a visual artist, and so I don't have any beautiful photos to show you. I apologize for that. I just want to talk to you a little bit about, for me, the context of Gordon Parks' work from the perspective of a social scientist. I'm a social worker and a social scientist by training, and the ways in which I think visual media and the way we depict people in that visual media is extremely important. So I wanted to, just going back to the exhibit itself, to try to think about three interrelated points. I think one of the things that's so powerful about this exhibit is it shows the ways in which, in 1948, Gordon Parks, as an established photographer, essentially, as a 36-year-old man, has to essentially sneak into life to present his photographs to the editors there, or to pitch his story, essentially, and he has to sneak in. And after photographing many, many frames, he sees that they have been significantly edited. And so there are ideas here, I think, that are important that certainly persist. I think we think about the conditions that people were living under in 1948 as being substantively different from today, but I would argue that they're actually not. Especially in terms of, both as a social scientist, as a person who's trying to get sort of intellectual ideas out into the world, but also with my collaboration with my partner, who is a visual artist, a photographer and documentarian, some of the challenges that we have faced when it comes to what images are allowed to be presented. So just for example here, when we're thinking about the ideas of selection and editing, who is actually in control of the process of editing? My husband had an experience recently when he photographed the uprisings in Ferguson, Missouri, for a national newspaper, a very prominent national newspaper, and was told that there were not enough white protesters in Ferguson. He didn't have enough photographs of white people protesting in Ferguson, and he told the photo editor at the very large newspaper on the East Coast that this is just who was here. I photographed who was present. And they told him in 2014 that that would make people uncomfortable, and so they really needed they needed to see some additional frames. So the issue of selection and who is in control of the edit remains incredibly important and relevant today. And I see this as sort of a continuity between what we do here as many of us are affiliated with either Berkeley or other universities, particularly also in the academy, whose voice is heard, who controls the narrative, who sets the narrative. And I think that's what Gordon Parks was trying to do, what he, as both of our presenters so adeptly portrayed, that he did think of himself as an activist, and he was trying to wrest a sense of control and agency back for the community that he presumably was representing. And so I think that's something just to sort of the idea of selection or editing or controlling the narrative that we still need to think about, particularly, I would say, in the present moment. As a social scientist, one of the things I think is really the most important as we think about poverty and about racial discrimination is what I call sort of this dominant narrative of the structural, right, versus the individual. So much of what we see in many portrayals, both in the contemporary moment and in the moment that Gordon Parks was working, and obviously his contemporaries, Roy Ellison and Roy DeCaraba and other very important cultural workers, is really the ways in which people who are marginalized, how they are portrayed, but essentially, are they portrayed as though it's their fault that they are vulnerable? Is it their fault that they are poor? Or is it some sort of individual characterological flaw? For example, what we heard just today, as we were thinking still sort of as our comrades in Puerto Rico are still dealing with the hurricane that swept through there. And just today, there was the comment made that they're just not working hard enough, right? And so the issue there is sort of whether or not people can survive some of the conditions that Gordon Parks was working so hard to portray in a round human way, oftentimes are reduced and sort of flattened, decontextualized, to be thought of as an individual characterological flaw as opposed to a structural constraint. And this is a particularly durable, persistent problem that we have in the United States, particularly as we think about conflating the idea of both poverty, vulnerability. Many of the pictures that you see in this exhibit really portray the marginalization of Black life in the late 1940s. Even the choice of the title is quite telling, that, Harlem Gang Leader, right? It could have just been Red, 17-year-old kid, right? But by ascribing a certain kind of choice to Red, it makes it seem as though he is this leader, and that he is involved in a gang, and that really this is an individual choice kind of question. So I think, particularly with the work of Gordon Parks, but other visual artists and people who consider themselves activists, documentarians, trying to push back against the dominant narrative in a way that suggests what are the structural constraints here? What are the resources that what are they missing essentially, that may lead them to make what we would consider in the United States, quote unquote, poor choices. So I'm not sure if, sort of in the United States, that's the dominant paradigm that I think Gordon Parks was in many ways struggling against and really trying to resist and to push back against as the dominant voice in American culture. And I would argue that that problem really persists into the present. And sort of just to make essentially my last point here that I want to make about this, about these interrelated questions that I think Gordon Parks' work really raised for us, is really what I call this sort of long mouthful here, but the persistently durable challenge of depicting Black people as humans in 3 dimensions. I think this is really what, in many ways, what was Mr. Parks' life's work. And I think we certainly struggle with that now. And as a social scientist, I can tell you that often I read a lot of work of other social scientists who consistently situate the problem of poverty or of racial discrimination as an issue of race relations between 2 people, as though it's not a structural phenomena. And this issue, I think, again, is one of the reasons I'm really drawn to the visual arts, is because it gives us a different language to try to understand and to really portray the full humanity of people that are often essentially reduced to either gang leaders, quote unquote, or we see a lot of magical Negroes in film, on TV, people who are perceived to be the oracles, without sort of ascribing to them 3-dimensionality, right? The idea that you can just be a boring Black person too. You could be a Black nerd, that's also okay. So I think, sort of in closing here, to try to think about the ways in which Gordon Parks really succeeded in this long struggle to find agency, and also, as particularly as Makeda and Ken mentioned, to find agency, but to find a way to capture it visually, which is incredibly difficult to do without words, but he managed to do incredibly successfully with dignity and a certain, and a humanity, which I think was his ultimate project in many ways. So that's where I will close. Thank you.
Hello? Okay, great. Well, let me just thank each of you for your wonderful presentations and the just really great contextualizations of Gordon Parks' work and his life. Makeda, thank you for helping us to understand the significance of the making of an argument in the context specifically of Parks's World War II era work and immediate post-war work. And Ken for helping us to understand the mechanics of Parks' visual activism as an activist photographer, as well as his technical proficiency. I think brings in a really important dimension to the conversation. And to Tina for helping us understand the persistent frames and constraints around representing Black life, both visually, but also in the academy and elsewhere in the media. So I'm gonna start with a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. But I wanted to ask, it seems that Gordon Parks is having maybe a bit of a moment right now, and I'm thinking, there's a renewed interest in his work. This exhibit here for us at Berkeley is a first. We've seen the circulation of Parks's recent color photographs, which appeared in both of Makeda and Ken's slideshows. Kendrick Lamar has sort of restaged some of Parks's images in his recent videos. So why Gordon Parks now? And why do you think that both he's having this moment and the significance of that for us right now?
I thought you were going to start off. You're going to say I'm going to start off easy with one of you guys.
Oh, no.
I think that that for me, I think that what's powerful about it, and I think that what people are kind of seeing, is the way in which the personal for him became a political tool in his personal story, his personal experience, how he translated that. And I think that he's also using, in that way, in that same way, he's using kind of motifs and tools that are common to society. Like he's not, his images of, for example, segregation, they're not the images of Charles Moore or the famous images that we know from, the sit-ins or the violent confrontations. They're very subtle, and they work in a way in which they're very familiar images, but yet they're very powerful, and they have a social message. And I think that appeals to people. I mean, everyone's taking pictures now, but how do you make those ordinary pictures say something? And his pictures are in many ways ordinary, but then they're not ordinary. So there's this kind of strange way in which he was able to operate. But I think that one of the reasons why he's overlooked, and that's also why he's overlooked, because they're not necessarily loud pictures. And also there has been a pervasive kind of dismissal of people who work in color photography. Color is associated with commercial work and is associated with magazines, and that was seen as not unserious journalism. So that has been a problem that his work has faced. But now, color the reception of color has changed in America or in society. So that's also changed as well.
Yeah, I wonder if a little bit of it is that he's seen as an activist now, not just a photographer. And the idea that you could be a journalist, as he was, I mean, he was a journalist at Life magazine, and could be an activist, was a no-no for a very long time. And I think there's kind of been a shift that journalists now have a different kind of voice, particularly in the last year, of course. And that activism that he had is really, he's a role model of someone who was just not a brilliant photographer, but actually had an axe to grind, a big axe to grind, a personal axe. And that was just not allowed. And I think that's changing.
Well, following that, can you say a little bit maybe about who in your fields you see as sort of taking up, as a kind of inheritor of Gordon Parks's work and legacy, as a visual activist, as a journalist, in the sort of the broad field of photography that you have access to, Makeda, or even in the kinds of the places in which meaning making happens, both in and out of the academy. But what kinds of work do you think take up the spirit of Parks's ideas and his work that we see circulating today? Is there a particular artist or?
I think there are quite a few. Maybe Hank Willis Thomas is probably one of them. Latoya Ruby Frazier, artists who define themselves as activists first and as visual artists as well. They see them as intertwined. Maybe those are two.
I think that there's a lot of them out there, but it's too early in a way to identify who they are. In the same way we're now looking at Gordon Parks and what he did decades later. I think that, going out to some of the things, even in the last week that were happening at Berkeley, you see so many photographers out there shooting, and the question is, where does that work go, and how do we end up seeing it, and what is the body of work going to look like? So I think it's kind of almost a historical question. You have to wait a little bit.
Yeah, and we have to wait, and we also have to explore who else is in the archive that we've overlooked, because as I said,
Yes,
Gordon Parks
absolutely.
has been overlooked, and
Yes.
and exhibitions. His foundation first began organizing these exhibitions quite a few years ago. The first one's at Boston MFA on Fort Scott, Kansas, and these kinds of efforts are very important. But this kind of gathering together the archives and presenting them in these forums, they've been instrumental in kind of recasting him in the history of photography. But there are many more people out there who have been overlooked, whose archives are sitting somewhere, and who need attention. And that's, I think, also a legacy of this type of project, is that those people are getting attention, because we're saying the history of photography has been very narrow, and there are lots of people who we need to pay attention to.
Well, even someone like Roy DeCarava, who's brilliant, but you hardly see his work anymore. I mean, he had a moment when he had the big show at the Museum of Modern Art, which was a number of years ago. So there are many more, and I think what you're saying is true, that there's these archives that we have to farm and see and get out into the world.
Also, I think in terms of with journalism and with academics in particular, the standard has always been to be neutral. And I think that presents a particular constraint that Gordon Parks was overtly and very explicitly trying to challenge, the idea of neutrality. And so for me as an academic, and also someone who's really, again, interested in visual media, I'm not sure who I do think there are many current photographers who do work that would be considered activist, or sort of trying to take a more political point of view on art, that I think is really important. But I think that constraint remains, particularly when you're talking about photojournalists who work at newspapers, who have the sort of yoke of neutrality around them. But as Ken mentioned, I think Gordon was a role model in trying to say, listen, we do have something to say, and this is the moment. We may not be able to be neutral. And secondly, that again, in the editing process, whatever was supposedly neutral before is no longer. So the idea of neutrality is really not true. And so I think that Gordon Parks walked into that very boldly.
I think this is a good time to open it up to audience questions. I believe there's a microphone coming around, so raise your hand high. Right there.
I noticed in the photo of the Gang Leader article that the photo credit was to Gordon Parks, but it didn't say who did the text. So was he involved in that text? And if not, was he able to in any way influence how the text told that story or that narrative?
It's an innovative photo essay in that a lot of the text is just his own interviews and his own recording of what was said. So yeah, I mean that's what it was. And then in between, you'll see there are some texts that are kind of written in addition to kind of flesh out, or like that introductory part I referred to, where the school children getting out of school, that part. But no, most of it is from his interviews and his own kind of retelling of the story.
I just want to add to that as well that, again, this is that question of editing, because so much, there's sort of, the length of time that Parks spent following Jackson around and sort of, gaining his trust and his family's trust, and then that not only are the images being edited, right, but the text is being edited as well. And so how then, what parts of the language we see and how that then gets recontextualized in the space of the article. I mean, I think the show itself is really good at really pulling out sort of, restaging a kind of longer story and some of those negotiations that happen in both image and text.
Hello, thank you very much for your comments. And going through the exhibition, I saw the last photographs, which were recent photograph, or relatively recent photographs of Red Jackson, you know, attending the exhibit of Parks' photographs and of himself, of these series. And I was wondering if anybody asked him if there are any interviews of Red Jackson, of his reactions to the series and how he was portrayed, and the whole series was portrayed in this exhibit.
I think, didn't he famously say, you know, you made a criminal out of me? Like, he was very like, wow, you really made me look like a cool guy. It's kind of that kind of reaction. But then I think at the end he had the feeling that he wanted to, you know, he thought that the photographs and the whole story could and how he looked in the contemporary moment could teach people and teach young people that it wasn't a life that they should follow. I think that there was a story that they missed each other just within days. I think Parks was hospitalized at the time when Red went to the exhibition, and he did not get to see him that last time, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for this. I had one question, which was a two-part question, I guess. At his time, was he recognized, or during his lifetime, was he recognized as an arts photographer or more of a journalist? Like, would the public be able to see his photographs in the context only of print? And then, two, to your point, a lot of, you know, like there was the issue with, well, a lot of media publications are struggling with like getting diversity within their own ranks, and then also, like you said, being the yoke of objectivity, like backlash to reporters injecting what they would consider bias in their work. So I guess I was wondering if there has been progress in giving a voice to this type of social justice in the media, and where you see if there are changes in the industry happening, or how the path forward for dealing with that, I guess.
Do you want, someone want to answer the first question about how his work was perceived?
Well, go ahead with the second question.
Oh, okay. I think that there, I mean, in some ways I'm not the best person to answer this question. I do think that there's some openness given, particularly given the sort of expansion of media outlets and different types of media. But I do think there is a particular scrutiny in this moment, given our trying to think about the quality of news, right, and the quality of news reporting, as well as the images that are presented. I know that in particular for photojournalists, there is still a sort of a woeful lack of racial or ethnic and gender diversity among the ranks of photojournalists. That I do know. In terms of print journalists, I don't have a good sense of that. But I think the idea of being neutral or objective, certainly I'm not suggesting that that is not important. All I'm saying is that we need to be honest about the ways in which our biases as people who are in the social world, no matter our position, are reproduced in the kind of media that we produce. That's essentially what I was hoping to just put a little bit of a finer point on that.
Yeah, I think in the photo world he was well recognized, and he had many books, including his autobiography, but other books of his photographs. And of course, when he started doing films, I mean, my God, you know, his first movie was like an explosion of him as just a creative person. And everyone knew he did music, and he wrote the score, and he wrote poetry, and like I said, he was really a Renaissance man. And I think very high profile, very dignified. He lived in New York. He was in that whole group of intellectuals and artists in New York. So I think he was.
Yes, and he was also very rare in that he was an African-American fashion photographer. I mean,
Yes,
that's where
absolutely.
he made some amazing works, and a lot of what you see today, that kind of image where you see someone standing on the street and it's all blurry in the background, I mean, that's what he was doing in the 1950s and 60s. I mean, that kind of look is him, really.
And just another plug for the film series. You should, you should, I mean, Shaft.
Are they
Right.
showing both shafts, or?
I think,
Because the second shaft, he's actually in the movie.
right. I'm not sure, I think Stephanie has stepped out, but yeah, I know, I think Shaft and the Learning Tree and some of the shorts are being shown. So it also just gives you a sense, of the breadth of his talent. And then by the end of his life, he was making sort of abstract images as well.
And in constantly writing. I mean, I think if you notice, there's a difference between the quotes that I gave and that Ken gave, but that basically said the same thing, is because he was constantly returning to the same ideas and saying them kind of different ways. But yeah, I mean, not only was he a humanist in his photography, but even in his kind of personal life. I mean, he famously photographed a young boy in Brazil, who was the boy who had Flavio, who had some sort of life-threatening disease. But he brought the boy to the States and helped him with his care. And, yeah.
Hi, thanks very much for this very stimulating discussion. I have a question about whether Gordon Parks himself or whether any of you sees an inherent, at least possible potential tension between journalism and art. Whether there's whether there can be whether an image that's presented as an aesthetic image, whether there's an inherent risk of it sort of tending away from the political. I'm not saying that I think that is necessarily the case, but I think there can be. I think that's a relevant question about the context in which a work is presented. And Life is an interesting hybrid, perhaps, because it's supposed to be journalism, but it's sort of feature journalism, and the images obviously were manipulated to look more artistic, but he was also an artist. So I'm just curious about his own reflections on this potential tension, or your reflections on either how his work was presented, or what you think about whether the power of his images might have been limited, constrained, neutralized by being presented more as aesthetic images than as news or documentary.
I think that there's an important distinction to be made in the ways in which we are looking at the images now and the ways in which they were encountered then. First, I mean, right now we're seeing them in a museum, and that's not necessarily how, of course, people encountered them. I mean, we tend to, now they're being sold at, I just bought one myself, bought one from my own institution 2 weeks ago. Now they're being sold at, high fine art prices, certainly. But I do think that at the time, and certainly in kind of the history of photography, that his work has actually been overlooked for that fact, because they're beautiful. Because how is an image like that one of the woman and the child standing outside, how is that an image of activism? How is that? It's so beautiful. And that has been certainly something that I think has affected his legacy, because his images were different. They weren't, again, as I've already mentioned, these kind of, they weren't obvious in their statements, and they communicated through other means. And I think it's taken till now for people to understand how they were communicating. But again, I think that beauty of his images is certainly something that impacted his legacy, and that kept him from being seen as an important documentarian, certainly. But it is an ongoing question of how does documentary become art? And it's not just his work, it's Dorothea Lange, it's all of these people. How does something like how do those works get plucked out of history? And it's something their own subjects had issues with. I mean, Dorothea Lange's most famous subject, of migrant mother, Florence Henderson, what was her name? She was very uncomfortable with her image being used in the way it was, and how it became famous. She was on a postage stamp and all of these things. So the subjects themselves are often uncomfortable, but it's an ongoing issue with documentary, certainly.
And you have to remember that in the era he was photographing, photography had absolutely no value at all as an art object. And so prints, you could buy Ansel Adams print for $10, So there was absolutely no market, which changed in the 70s. And also what changed is we do not have Life magazine anymore. And so the museums have really become the Life magazine of the contemporary world, where photographers who are doing in-depth stories are looking, how do you get out a work? And it's not only museums, it's also books have become the new Life magazines. And if you look, there's a huge explosion of books out there of photographers doing bodies of work, and that's really the only venue to really get it out. So that has really changed. And I don't think he was constrained in his work. I think if you look at the contact sheets, you notice what was constrained were the white male editors, I should say, because women were not editors at all at Life magazine. They were secretaries. They might act as editors, but they were never considered editors. It was all white men selecting the images. And any photographer will tell you when they get an assignment, they go out and they shoot what they want to shoot. It's the editor who decides what we see, and then we have to go in later into the archives and really see what he saw and pull out those images. And if you look at the context in the show, there's some amazing images, beautiful images, powerful images that were not selected because they didn't fit really the story that the editors wanted to tell. And it was really the editors telling it. It was, Gordon Parks was just, I hate to say the tool of the editors, but they were the ones who decided what pictures would be used in the end. Particularly if you wanted to continue working at Life magazine. Your first assignment, you don't say, no, you can't use that picture. You stand and you just do what the bosses say.
Tina, did you want to add anything, even just from your own work of trying to, how to make visual images alongside a kind of, in some ways very strictly defined social science framework?
I think, it's very hard, and it's very hard to be able to sort of blur those boundaries between what is journalism and what is art. For me, it's very hard. I had the book reviewer for my manuscript, one of their first comments was, is this person a journalist or an academic? And it was certainly a pejorative. To ask if I was a journalist, except I, knowing that journalists are great writers, took it as the ultimate compliment. But that boundary, I think particularly in certain disciplines, people want to hold a stricter or more rigid boundary, and I think that might be the case in both documentary and in art. My husband has certainly faced that in terms of trying to think about how to position his work as a photojournalist, and now much more so as an artist. So I think that's sort of an enduring tension that I'm sure that Gordon faced as well.
I just want to add too, because I think also part of maybe what I was hearing in part of your question and thinking about the kind of tension, right, is also a question about what does it mean to aestheticize certain kinds of suffering, and what each of these sort of photographic genres allow. And I think the answers the panelists have pointed to about a kind of interdisciplinarity, about a free-flowingness of representation is also evident in the sense of what it means to represent humanity, right, in its kind of in all of its aspects. Because I think one of the ways those genres of photography have been kept separate is that on one hand, right, like, a certain kind of documentary photography or photojournalism is meant to represent suffering, struggle, right, resistance, these kind of big, loud ideas in certain kinds of ways. And one of the ways that you get at that as well is to represent, suffering, right? But I think also this sense then that it's also a question of shifting the project, right? And how I think, what I'm hearing from all of you is how Parks really subtly shifted the project of what does it mean to represent segregation is also to represent Black life and humanity in the face of that, right? As opposed to only just the kind of suffering and indignation. And I think we are in a moment where we are learning a language for that, right? Thinking through a kind of, the aesthetics Black Lives Matter, right? And thinking through what we mean by human and humanity. And so I think that there is a kind of, there's a breadth to, and an importance to, I think what Makeda pointed out, to the power of the quiet image, right, as well. Well, let me ask, do you have any particular favorite images of Parks, photographs that you've seen of Gordon Parks that really moved you?
Well, the one I just purchased for my institution is the emerging man, the one that both Ken and I showed. I think that images mean certain things at certain times, and you are drawn to certain images at a certain moment. And there are several in that series, and one of them, the man is pulling the manhole cover up, and he's kind of turning. But that one is the one where he's looking out, and that's the one I thought students today would really benefit from that, and they would benefit from that story and that kind of spirit of that man looking out rather than kind of looking over his shoulder. So I think that certain images of his mean different things, mean different times. I mean, before it was that one of the woman and the child, when that work first appeared many years ago. But I think different moments, different times, different images.
Yeah, I love the Ella Watson picture. And I think I love it because all the FSA photographers traveled all over America to photograph it, and he just went right in the damn building, right there, and found this iconic subject. I mean, this woman who was a washerwoman scrubbing the floors for the government, and it's just such a beautiful, beautiful image, and the power and the dignity, and of course with the American flag there, and it's just it's wonderful. And just a kind of side story, I don't know, 25 years ago I was one of the founders of the Mother Jones Documentary Fund, and we actually went to Gordon, or I didn't, but one of my colleagues went to Gordon, and he gave us 100 prints of that to donate to the organizations, which we then sold. And that just was remarkable, because that is an iconic image, I think, of his career, that he would be so generous and want to continue the next generation of photographers doing the work that he did.
I mean, I'm not a Gordon expert, as my co-panelists are. Many of the images I love. I think the one that Ken pointed out today that is so striking is the young woman and her child under that neon sign, because as you think about what it would take to go get that neon sign made and hang that up there, and it is quite astonishing, I think, in some ways is the word.
I want to thank all of you, each of you, for your comments. And I was particularly touched in looking at the exhibit before I came in today by his evidently holding the photograph of Red that was intended for the cover. And I wanted to ask each of you your comments and thoughts about that.
I was really struck by that too, I think, honestly, for me, the sort of the kind of that ethical choice of sort of being in a moment and making an ethical choice to destroy one's own work, actually just, it's one of those sort of small stories that I think gives me fortitude, right, for my own participation in movements for social justice. That sometimes the most important the act that we take up may be in a moment may personally injurious, but can also be small in the sense that it's one image in a huge body of work, but that, what it means to forego personal and professional prestige, right? This would have been not only his first story for Life, but his first, a cover image, but the importance of fighting for that in the moment. And I think for me, it's just another recognition of how important and how true Gordon Parks was to his work and his activism.
I think that for me, that at this time, a lot of photographers in history of photography, there's a lot of talk about humanism and the humanist camera and the humanist photographer, but there isn't that kind of ethical decision making. You don't find a lot of stories like that. So I think that it was striking for that reason. And then going back to a kind of theme that we have gone over today and mentioned today, that is a kind of a role model for people. How do you do work in your life, and how do you also maintain a sense of your own integrity and your own sense of ethics, and what is the balance and what is the line? I think that that's an important, broader question for us all.
And just to echo these comments, I think one of the things that was the most striking to me about that is, to call someone an activist the way we have been sort of banding about that term, to me, that is the position in which he was an activist. Because to be an activist comes at some personal risk or loss. And he risked that to sort of take a strong ethical stance, as Leigh mentioned, to lose his first cover. But I think that's the critical distinction there, is that you really have to have, I think, something to lose by putting your own, you sort of have to have some skin in the game. And he did that in that instance, and it's really something I think to try to take a real lesson from.
Good afternoon. I wanted to know if the cell phone has entered into the realm of art or photojournalists.
Professor Photojournalism.
Yeah. Well, there are many people doing cell phone photography. I mean, I think it's mainly Instagram and Facebook, which, in terms of social activism is, of course, very, very important, because it's a kind of instant, we call citizen journalists, kind of reaching out. But I think working photographers are still dependent on the traditional camera, although it's digital and shooting.
Although sometimes the cell phone photographer is the first one there, and
Yes.
that's what's happening. And there are interesting kind of legal questions about what happens to those images, such as during the London bombing, that photograph in the metro, that was by an amateur photographer. And what was the status of that image? What should he do with it? Who owned it?
Also.
And yes, yeah. So there are interesting questions about that kind of production and what happens when it's disseminated so quickly.
Just out of curiosity, at Harvard, are you starting to collect these kinds of images? What, is that?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No. I mean, certain institutions are, but I think that, museums, like there's an exhibition right now at the Met of cell phone photography, and they're all blown up. It's like, what's the point? I thought they were on a screen.
Right.
But I think that museums have a hard time collecting them because they aren't printed on the same types of material. They don't have the same kind of, provenance and story behind them as a traditional photograph, so they're a little bit difficult to collect. And again, it seems sort of contradictory to collect an image that was made on a phone.
I was going to say one of the biggest problems with the cell phones, and if you look at Gordon's work, you see no cell phones. So there's the photograph I showed of Harlem, of all the men in the audience they were watching Malcolm X with their hats. They're actually involved, they're actually watching, they're actually listening. If you go out today, if you were to make that picture today, none of those people would actually be listening. They would actually be holding up their cell phones, taking a picture or live streaming it. And from the standpoint of a photographer, it's horrible. It's horrible. I tell my students, can you imagine Dorothy Lang's migrant mother, and there she is, and she's on her cell phone, with the kids? I mean, it's just...
And there's also a loss of history that happens, I mean, with these digital technologies and
Yes,
phones.
absolutely.
And, what you save and what you delete. I mean, famously, of course, we only know what Monica Lewinsky looked like because there happened to be somebody shooting analog photography.
Right.
So, I mean, that's not necessarily the pivotal moment in history, but it's an example.
Yeah, we might not have these Gordon Parks images if they had been digital files. Would they have been saved and
Because they would be beautiful enough, or they wouldn't be, I mean, they would be, not dramatic enough or something.
Right.
Yeah.
One more question? Oh,
What are your thoughts about the valuation or devaluation of photography as we see the rise of these sort of, the ephemera of photos that are taken on phones?
I'm not sure I understand.
The value, I mean, how has this affected the value of photography?
I think photography is still incredibly powerful, and even with the cell phones. I mean, I think the cell phones, as was said, is often it's the first person on the scene, and of course, particularly now with the issue of cops shooting black people and minorities. My God, without cell phones, we still would be believing that they deserve to be killed. So, well, but not like it was in Gordon Parks' era, where people would say, well, he was running. Why was he running? He deserved to be shot. He was running from the police. Now we see that. So I think they're incredibly powerful, but there's something about a photographer who's really studied and thoughtful, very focused. And I think that's the difference with cell phones, is people are really not focused. They're just shooting a moment, and they're not really understanding sometimes what that moment is, other than there's a crowd of people. They're not really thinking about the light, the composition, that second that you see in Gordon Parks' photographs. I mean, who knows? I'm thinking of the image with the neon sign, because I just find it mind-boggling that someone would make a neon sign like that. I wonder if he saw that and then he came back and he waited for that woman and her child. How long did he wait? Was it instantaneous? And so the difference with a photographer is they're thinking about that, and he may have seen that, and then the woman wasn't there, but he knew he had to come back because he recognized the evil of that neon sign, and he had to find something of beauty, which is, of course, the mother and the child, just the way they're dressed and their poise under this just incredibly harsh sign. And so I think that's the difference between those people who use cell phones and those people who see themselves as image makers.
No doubt. I think what I was not the actual value of photographer, which I of course obviously laud photographers and love photographers. What I was getting at is, I know even at the Chicago Sun-Times, they got rid of all of their staff photographers,
Yes.
and they have journalists go out with cell phones. That's what I was sort of getting at in terms of the.
Yeah, well, that's.
And whether you see that as sort of a trend that's directly related to the rise of the sort of the easy access to these kinds of cameras, or.
Well, I think it's just a shift in the media that people have less and less money to hire journalists. They want journalists to do everything, take the picture, write the story, or vice versa. That's changed. But I think the bottom line is there's always going to be those dedicated people like Gordon Parks who, despite working for Life magazine, was able to forge a brilliant career of making important images that really were so much better than Life. I mean, we hold Life up very high, but we often forget it was a commercial magazine, and as soon as it was not commercial, they killed it. And I look at that amazing photograph of the end of the story of Red walking in the suit, backlit. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful picture. And when you look how it's placed in the magazine, it's like a tiny little thing surrounded by horrible ads. And, they probably they knew it was a great picture, but it was all about ad revenue. So the photographers were really second to the advertising revenue that Life magazine created, and we don't often think of it that way.
well, thank you all for coming out. Please join me in thanking Makeda Best, and if you haven't, take the time to see the show, which is in the basement. Join us for the reception outside, and do come back for the film series in November, sorry.